Hello and welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. I'm here back in the studio with my friends and colleagues.
David Kennedy.
And Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. And in this episode, we want to talk about unexpected death and the grief process that is a result of unexpected death. For those of you who have been listening to our podcast, we've been talking about grief and the grief process in other episodes, but today we really wanted to take some time to identify, talk, discuss, honor that when death arrives in a way that is sudden, that was unexpected, there are some other things we need to be aware of, and in that we will need some support and in that process. So when we're talking about unexpected death, what are we talking about?
Well, I think the thing that immediately comes to my mind is the death that's the result of accidents. Accidental death, that could be motor vehicle, it could be accidental death in all kinds of situations. But that's death that certainly was not expected. And along with that, of course, are all the other categories, things like suicide, homicide, accidental death of overdose, which is one we hear a lot about. And although that one may be accompanied by, signs where people have been on the edge of death before, it's amazing how that unexpected piece is still there. But there certainly are those other major categories where people experience the death of someone they love, and the grief that then impacts them is a grief that has layers to it that may not be there in other type of grief.
Mm-hmm. I think you could throw in maybe an unknown medical condition, so a sudden heart attack or a sudden stroke the condition wasn't known. And even if the condition was known and life was expected to have several more years, but something happens sooner, that can feel unexpected. I think natural disasters is another sort of example of how death can be sudden and unexpected, but happen.
A workplace accident, a fire.
Yep.
So all of those really do. And they're prevalent, so they all happen, and that's the whole idea of that unexpected, is they catch us off guard, and we're not prepared, like we may be. And we've talked about this too, even in an anticipated death or an expected death. When that death actually happens, there's still a sense of, wow, I can't believe it actually happened. But this we're talking about where life is going on, and you've made plans, you're in the midst of life, it's all about living, and then all of a sudden something happens. And those layers of grief, I think, are very important for us to talk about today, just to encourage people that they're not going crazy, and that this does bring a piece into their grief that may not be there with some other people.
I want to begin also just by saying that unexpected death often ripples throughout a community too. And so there are often people impacted by it who are grieving, who might be at a much further distance, might not have even known the person. I think of some of the traumatic accidental deaths we've had in our community, and I know I was deeply feeling some of them, but had actually no contact with those families or those individuals. And I think part of that is because of that suddenness. It's hard for our brains to comprehend this, that when we don't see death coming, and that idea that an individual or a family is going about their normal life. They were traveling somewhere, or they set out of their house that morning, just like the rest of us do every day, and then tragedy strikes. And I think that often that creates a lot of unease in us. And so it has this ripple effect through our communities.
It's like you're sort of describing like a psychic injury, almost, that sense of that your psyche, because there's no ability to anticipate and prepare for, psychically, emotionally, when a death is anticipated, maybe there's been cancer and it's been sort of maybe longer, and we spoke about the importance of a vigil. When that doesn't exist, that psychic shift that's required is so sharp and so sudden and so, I mean, it's almost unbelievable, as you said, David. But there's that, without that ability to prepare, to get ready for it, it is a real, I don't want to say it, it's like a punch to the head. More so than even like when you said, David, like even with an anticipated death, when it happens, there's a bit of shock. But the shock is amplified in a sudden death because of that inability to have the time to prepare.
I wonder too, I'm just thinking as both of you are talking that perhaps part of that is the idea that it confronts us in our most vulnerability, where suddenly we can't escape the fact that, oh my gosh, that could have been me. And that we're suddenly, as we're reading about that accident, or we're listening to the news report, or we may come across the accident on the highway, and all of a sudden, that thought, oh, that could have been me. If I'd have been there 5 minutes earlier, that would have been me. So while we live our life trying to escape our own death and dying, when these sudden unexpected things are right there, I think it confronts us in our vulnerability.
The world is no longer safe.
Exactly.
Right? And the illusion of our safety is just wiped away in an instant. Right?
Yeah, I so agree with that it rubs right up against our vulnerability and this ability that we often have to just kind of put death over on the shelf. Yeah, I kind of know it's there, but I kind of keep getting to live with thinking that, that's not coming for me or anybody that I love anytime soon. And then when we see that happen out there in our community, it does remind us death is maybe not as far away from any of us as we would like to believe, and protect ourselves from believing.
And then we hear things like, it shook my world.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right?
The ground cracked underneath my feet.
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is different about the grief when it comes to this is this idea of preventability. And preventability, I think, is always a part of every grief. Even people who have lived with a death that they know is coming, they still go back over and look for things they could have done to prevent it. But when we're talking about a sudden death, I think preventability really gets accentuated. And this can take a long time to work through for people who are looking for reasons. I think one of the other pieces that happens in unexpected death around this is that people need somebody to blame for this. And they try to find, a reason why this happened, but the reason is more of a blame reason than any other kind of search. To the point where it's funny how we even talk about that was an accident. Well, on one level, it wasn't an accident because somebody did something that they shouldn't have done. So that's not exactly accidental, but that's the process of our thinking. So who's to blame for it? Who's going to pay for this? How do we find justice in unexpected death?
The way I often understand that, David, when I hear that from clients, is that's their way to try to put order back in a world that feels so chaotic and unpredictable, which is really terrifying for us, right? When all of a sudden we think, this life that was, or this world that felt fairly predictable and isn't, and then we have this immense trauma come at us, for the brain to default to blame and let's find a place to put that is, I really think, our way of just trying to create some order out of the chaos.
It's that control, right? We've lost control. So now the world is unsafe. So now we're vulnerable. How do we put order and control back in place? Well, someone's responsible. Someone's got to pay for this. This was someone's fault because it knocked my sense of order, it knocked it to the ground. But what do we have here is we have our reality has been shaken. And so we need to try to work to put it back together again. And so that sense of someone's got to pay, that there's an explanation, as you were saying, for this it's almost essential to put this person back together again almost.
And you're right. I think it is essential in the sense that, I never try to discourage people from exploring that, because I think when we're looking at an anticipated death, somebody with a diagnosis of cancer, maybe we do the same thing, only we have that period of time to do that before the death. So we look at, oh, why did you get cancer? Why did so we do that preventability piece while that person is still here. But when there's that sudden death, we don't have that chance. So all of a sudden it follows in a way in which there is no way to change what has happened. And so we are the first part of that grief journey. The first thing we deal with is that trauma and that piece of, oh my gosh, why did this happen? How could this have happened? Where did it might be blame. Where did I go wrong? Or why didn't I, stop him from going out that night? There's all kinds of ways in which we frame that preventability piece. But I think it may be that thing. As I'm just listening to you, both of you, I'm realizing, yeah, we probably do that beforehand in an anticipated death, where now we have to do it after the death.
Yeah, and I agree with you, David, that I don't, I make sure when I'm sitting there as therapist and I'm hearing somebody do a lot of the blaming, and especially if there's a lot of, aggression or, towards somebody else, I have learned, my clients have taught me this, that I really just need to hold space for that's part of their process. And there's been times I've heard people lay blame at the feet of people where I might feel a bit hard to hold for that, because it feels really harsh. But now I've just understood, like, that's part of their process, and maybe we can unpack that at another time, and hopefully where appropriate, some of that can shift, but that can feel protective. That's a way also, I think, for the traumatized brain to direct its energy over there. It's a form of, I think, numbing or dissociation from the full impact of the death. And so it does have its role. And so I'm thinking, for the person who's listening to this episode, if you're supporting someone and you're hearing them make big comments about who's to blame, it can feel really hard not to want to challenge some of that, especially if it doesn't all seem rational. And that is part of how we can hold compassion for their process.
Well, it certainly is true, Julie, with the self-blame too. And you're right. And I think when people start down that road of self-blame and there are other people around them, the first thing they do is try and shut them down. Oh, you shouldn't think that. There's nothing you could have done. All which is true, but that person actually has to follow through themselves on that journey. And so you're right. The greatest gift we can bring is simply to hold space, allow them that. We may have a chance at the right time later on to reassure them that, you might be exploring that a little harshly. Mm-hmm. But I think to shut people down too quickly before they have had a chance to verbalize how they honestly feel is not helpful in that process. But you're right. It's really hard to hear that. And especially if somebody is self-blaming and they're just really hard on themselves. It takes everything not to try to just shut them down and give them all the positive stuff, right?
And sorry, Red, I just want to say to that, if it is feeling really hard, you can even just acknowledge that. You can say, this isn't how I see it, but I understand that this is where you need to be right now, right? You can label both. We can make room for both.
I was just going to say, at what point in that process, if we're talking about that, it's part of the grieving process. At what point we were talking about an accident, let's say, and then there are charges laid and the courts become involved, and then it's court system doesn't move along so quickly, and that can often sort of impair or impact or delay a full grieving response because we're tied up in the court battle. We're tied up in finding out who was at fault, who was wrong, who's going to pay for my pain. When that becomes the focus, at what point does it then become complicated in terms of that is the only expression of my grief is that someone needs to pay? Or I'm at fault, that self-blame. Yes, it might be a natural part of the process, but there's got to be a place where it then, if it becomes a sole focus, it complicates the grief because the person can't move past it.
Well, I think you've hit the right word. It is a complicated grief. And people, and we all know, we've listened to the people who publicly say, I need to find closure in this court case. Well, the truth is you don't find closure in a court case. But you're absolutely right, Red. I have found that people focus on that. And there's some part of our grief that needs to wait until that is over. And in my experience, people are never get what they think they're going to get. And one of my profs, he had a favorite line. He used to say, "There's no such thing as justice. All we have is law, and law does not always give us what we feel is justice." And so people, even when that court thing does come, it leaves them feeling less than they had hoped or unsatisfied. But no matter what that is, I agree, there's some things we cannot do until that has absolutely finished.
Yeah, and in many ways, so the closure there is the closure of the legal process.
Right.
That's where the closure is.
That's the closure.
And that often is, and I think this is what you're saying, David, is that often then just makes way energetically, psychically, to begin more of your own grieving process. And I've certainly heard that from clients, like, it will be better when, but what may be better is, well, we won't be in the legal process then. Right. We won't, right. It's tiring, it's exhausting, it's triggering often, but it won't, the grief is not better. In fact, it often intensifies. Mm-hmm. And I think that one of the things that sometimes happens is support then backs out when the legal process is done. Okay, let's say there has been, quote, justice, or that's what's the term, or the right thing happened here today at the end of whether it's the coroner's investigation or the legal process. What can happen is that people supporting that family may assume, okay, good, we've got it to where it needs to go, but that actually might be that family's beginning of their grief process.
Oh, I agree with you. And you're right. Just when they need that next wave of support, it gets pulled back because people think it's over. The other thing that can happen, and I don't want to spend all our time on the judicial system, but it often accompanies an unexpected death accident. But I do want to get back to Red's idea in a few moments about, heart attack and that kind of thing where there isn't a legal piece. But I do want to make one more point about the legal experience that I have shared with clients, and that is that sometimes that legal process introduces things that they didn't know of before and not necessarily in good light. And so the trial and that procedure itself becomes a trauma and traumatic, and they have to publicly hear things that they didn't either know or they certainly didn't want to have out in public. And it becomes then added to because it's often carried by media sources and the stories, and there's this constant reliving of that experience that they can't get past until we find that other piece. Yeah.
I've often heard people say, I can't even focus on myself until this is over. Mm-hmm. And that means they've put everything that they have in their emotional bank, they've locked it up, it's on hold until whatever that external process is completed. Yeah.
So if you're someone who's trying to support people who are in the legal process, sometimes the process I've also experienced is a coroner's report or a coroner's investigation where they're waiting for some more definitive cause of death or more information. That is the time when wherever that process finally ends, that's the time to move towards the people that you're trying to support. And make sure you're checking in with them because the grief often intensifies after that.
It really does. And even that piece we're talking about, preventability, it can be really strong like a tidal wave at the beginning. And then things get other things come in, and our grief intensifies around the loss of the relationship. And then, 3-6 months later, that person's back with preventability. So it's not something that they deal with once and it's over. It's something that can come back in waves. It can get triggered by other news medias that they've read or similar things. And all of a sudden they start back into that role of trying to figure out, could we have done this differently? Could we have prevented this? And is somebody, really at fault that hasn't been brought to justice? So that's where support needs to be patient. And again, often with people where, as you said, Red, where the courts can take years, that support comes and goes and wanes, and people get really tired of listening to you focus on this court case, and so they back away, and it gets pretty lonely sometimes.
I'm going to pull it back into that place of shock, because I'm thinking if you're supporting someone who has had a sudden death that maybe isn't trapped up in the courts, that sense of shock is so great because we have a term for it. The anticipatory grief phase was not present. And so if you're supporting someone who's been through a sudden death, the shock is going to probably have a stronger effect and potentially last longer. And so the act of grieving may be delayed further because the person is just trying to work their way out of shock. And if it was more like a heart attack or stroke, and if the surviving person actually witnessed that event, the crisis and the panic of watching someone who they know, or maybe don't know, but let's say they do, to watch their loved one go through that and to see the panic and to see the pain and to be witness there and not be able to do anything to stop it, to reverse the death, to not, be able to sort of step in and make it not happen. That then creates that trauma for that person. And so that shock can be, a much longer phase. And so if you're out there supporting someone with that, just realize that that's where that person might be for quite a while before the shock starts to wear off, or the death becomes real, or their own sense of blame for not being able to do anything is lessened, and they come back to a place where they understand that it wasn't their fault.
So, we see a certain amount of this with, quote, normal grief, with grief death that we lost, that we can see coming. We know that there's a delayed reaction to grief. And I'm thinking, it's really common to see grief intensify 4, 5, 6 months out. Would you guys agree?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yep. So what I see with unexpected death is that intensification sometimes happens even a year out, 10 months out, even longer than that. And that is not to say that they're not feeling strong waves of grief around that. But I've had clients, and I'm thinking specifically of some parents, right, who have lost a child unexpectedly, where they were able to return to work for a period of time where they thought, okay, by no means are they feeling okay, but they think, okay, I'm functioning. And then they're hit with this intensity, and then they're back off work. And of course, that's also often when support has waned away as well. And so I just want to really take a moment to really normalize that intensification that can happen so far out from the death that sometimes people don't even attribute it to the death anymore, exactly. Right? I have seen that happening where there's been so much shock and so much of that psychic numbing that we're seeing it, into the second year after the death, where the people in the support system of that person is kind of saying, hey, what's going on with this person? Or the person is saying, what's going on with me? But it's actually really the numbing is wearing off.
So, Julie, I have seen that 10 years out.
Sure.
With a parent whose child, it was 10 years out, and exactly what you're describing. And of course, by then, you're right. Everybody doesn't connect the dots. But that's exactly what was going on, and it's hard. It's hard to do that, to watch that, and it's hard for people in that experience but it does. It's that's why that, we talk about the waves and where we might say in a normal normal grief process where there's anticipation of the death, etc. Those waves will come and they'll come, but they diminish hopefully within 18 months or so. But in an unexpected death, it can be much, much longer. The other thing that I'm just sitting here thinking about our conversation with Blair, and he made the comment how, people with resuscitation, there's this idea, well, if you can get them to the hospital, then they're not going to die. So, people have heart attacks, and we assume that because, the paramedics, the EMS are there and they've got the CPR going and they've got the hospital, oh, they're going to be okay. And well, then they die. And then we're dealing with all of that piece of sudden death along with disappointment or shattered expectations.
He called that resuscitation glorification.
Yes, that was his term. Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. We don't live in a world, though, that accommodates death all that well. I'm sitting here thinking of the stories that you're telling about these parents, and I'm thinking, yeah, you probably in their contracts with work or in their collective agreements or whatever, they might have 3 to 5 days for a close family member, and then you're back to work. That's the expectation. And so, in this kind of example, in terms of the shock and the disbelief that must come from a sudden death. While we don't have a world that supports that very well, and we're sitting here talking about how to support someone in that capacity, boy, we're not set up. And so, of course, you got to get back to work. That's the expectation. The expectation is that your work is essential.
And maybe you could. Maybe that was the right decision initially. I have seen that where the structure was orienting, was stabilizing.
Positive distraction.
Yeah. And then later on, people are saying, well, what's wrong? Why are they going back off, a year or 2 years later? I have clients in this situation. And it's like, well, this is because the full wave of grief is now hitting them.
And that's exactly what I tell them is that, and you're right, some people go back to work because it feels back in control.
Yep.
I know what I can do here. I know what's expected of me here. I don't know that there. But I will always say to them, listen, I don't know what's going to happen 3 months down the road, which usually is a time period I look for. You may get there and you may realize I've run out of energy and I can't do this. That's normal. That is not the point to feel failure, because what they do is they set themselves up to feel like, okay, I've been back to work. Everybody's seen me. I should be okay. So if all of a sudden now I can't, there must be something wrong with me and I failed. So I really, really stress that. Look, and that's what you need to do, that's good. Good for you. But if you have to stop, it is not failure. But then we're back to the system that you identified, Red, that how do we now get that space that they need 6 months down the road? Because the insurance company's going to say, well, they should be over that by now. It's 6 months down, which is what the DSM says is normal. So all of a sudden now we're fighting to find that space so that person doesn't feel failure and help them to find their way in grief.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead, Dave. Red.
I was going to say, no, if you're swinging off of David's last comment, go for it, because I was going to switch
Well, I was
things
just
up.
going to say this is often when grief gets pathologized, because in order to help people get the money from their insurance companies and be off, they need a diagnosis, right? And then this is often, we start calling it depression, we call it anxiety, we call it, lots of whatever. And those things might be present, but often it's grief, and that's how grief is showing up with lots of anxiety and depressive symptomology. And so this is when then people start to get messages from others that something is wrong with me, rather than, no, you're just trying to live through a very traumatic experience, and it's taking your nervous system and your brain a long time to process this. And that's forever work. But certainly in those first few years.
Yeah. I was going to swing off madly in another direction there, so I'm glad you said that. Because I was thinking about listening to the stories, I'm thinking regret, and I'm thinking of, in terms of sudden death, that inability to resolve any relationship issues that might have existed between you and the person who has died, that could have been done had the death been anticipated and slow and not a sudden death. And now I live with this unresolved issue that sat between me and my person who has died that I thought I was going to resolve, but never got around to.
And probably the most pronounced of that is where it involves suicide. That where there can be, that those pieces of unresolved relational that can never be answered. So, and I know we're not going to deal with that here for very long, because I'd like to think we're going to do a whole podcast on that type of death. But I will say that it does remind me that some sudden death also brings aspects of shame. So some people feel that shame as a result of that sudden death, which again adds a whole layer of complication to the grief. So we can't talk about it. We don't want to talk about it. And that can be things such as suicide or mental health issues or drug issues. I have had clients, I'm sure you have too, where in bizarre sexual fantasies, a death has happened. So, the inability to talk publicly about the cause of death really creates barriers then to supporting and helping people in that sudden death experience.
Well, shame grows stronger when it lives in secrecy.
Exactly.
Right? And so those two things go hand in hand. And so then when we've got secrecy about part of the story of the death, then that's also part of your process of your grief. And so that becomes another barrier to the processing of that.
Mm-hmm. And again, that link, the link being not having the time, not having the opportunity to be able to say goodbye, to be able to prepare. And when those things happen, whether it's secrecy, whether it's an unresolved issue between two people, the fact that a sudden death steals that opportunity from us, it feels like it was taken from us. We didn't take advantage of the time that we had because we thought we would have more time. That's what we always think. We'll always have more time, right? But because that time is now not available and is lost, we're left with secrecy. We're left with regrets and unresolved relationship issues, if they exist, between people, and that then, because that can never be resolved. How do you manage that in your grief? Because that's going to be a part of that grief that you're carrying with you throughout the rest of your life, if you can't find a way to resolve it without the other person present.
So I'm sitting here thinking, and we all know this. I mean, we have all said this. The reality of, that's why we live every day and don't live for those regrets, Make sure we have those things looked after so that if suddenly I died tomorrow, there wouldn't be tons of things that people would be shocked. But the reality is we kind of all live with not really that way of life. So as much as we know that's the best way to do it. So,
well, and I think that, this kind of grief, what we're talking about here, requires more intervention and more support. And this is the kind of work that I know the three of us do. And because we need help processing these things, like the secrecy, like the shame, the regrets, and one of the things I find with people is really helping them, give them some space to the regrets, and where and coming back to what the truths of what they did know about that relationship. So I'm thinking of a person that I've been working with and coming back to, yes, I have these, in this case, more regrets that they didn't get to say goodbye, more regrets that they hadn't done something different, that they have done something more for this person. But what they can still come back to is, but there was love there. There was so much love there. And I know that's not the case for all, but you know, sometimes we have to give space to those regrets, and then we have to come back and say, you know, many of these regrets come from a place of love, come from a place of connection. And so let's come back to that. But that's work that needs help in the therapy room to process.
I agree. And I think that's the that's the reality of having someone who can just assist you and help you and listen more than helping. Just listen and direct you and guide you in some of those pieces that are so important with this dealing with this type of grief.
One of the things that we're talking about here, the work that needs to be done in the grief, is trauma. There's you know, so trauma is the nervous system being overwhelmed in a very big way to an event or series of events. And it's also about unprocessed memory. And so this is where people really need and really deserve some more support. You know, to not minimize kind of more expected grief, because of course that's very painful. But often if we have some good supports, if we have people that are giving our grief space, we are giving our own grief space, people will move through that. And, you know, the research tells us that. But more unexpected, complicated grief, you know, there's trauma there, and it really needs and deserves some additional support, and the work of a therapist, and the work of a therapist who really has some training in trauma.
And I think the key there, Julie, is identifying both those pieces, because people aren't self-aware of that distinction in the way that they need to be in order to be helpful. All they know is my world is upside down, and I'm numb, and I can't move, and and I'm having trouble functioning. So I think helping to distinguish those, because those are two separate pieces, even although they relate, they need to be looked at a little differently and to work with a little differently. But that's exactly why I think people who have had a traumatic experience with a sudden death, that getting that help around that trauma piece will be so helpful for them.
Yeah, I'm thinking, you know, I have some clients where a lot of the work we've had to do is around help with flashbacks, that they're having, you know, really vivid flashbacks to the day of the death or the circumstances around the death. And, you know, flashbacks can be so intense, cause panic attacks, can make us, you know, scared to go out in the world, scared to sleep. And so, you know, that requires more help. And it can, there are tools and there are strategies that a trauma therapist can help you process that.
Is it fair to say that the trauma approach really does focus on that brain part of how we are both reliving that experience and how we are internalizing that experience with our thinking, our brain, where grief has that approach to relational? This is the person that I have lost. This is what this person, what it means to me. This person is not here. I don't mean to simplify it, but you know, the trauma really is that brain head refocusing and re-understanding and reimagining, and the grief is the work of the heart, the work of how do I live now and without that relationship the way it was.
Yeah, I would agree. And, you know, the trauma is really unprocessed memory. It is, I often use the phrase, it's not metabolized. And we need to go back in and we need to find what I call the sticky points where the brain is almost getting hitched on itself. And we have to help flush that through. If you think of it, I often use the metaphor of like a log jam in a river. We have to go in there and we have to try to unjam those logs so that they can flow down the river. Notice I'm not saying we can remove the logs. We many times we can't, but we need to help metabolize, get it unjammed and let it flow. And then that will allow people then also to do the work of the heart. But when we are so capsized by our trauma symptoms, that also interferes with our grief process.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm also aware we have not talked about survivor guilt, which often can be a component of expected death.
Yep. It's that a situation where maybe someone is in an accident and one person survives and the other person doesn't survive the accident, and the person who survives says, like, why me? Why am I why am I still alive and my partner or my child or my mother or my father are dead? How come I survived and they didn't? And being alive then becomes a source of guilt, because the pain that you're in has to find an outlet. And you know, if, let's say it was a car accident or something like that, and you were the driver, then you have that sense of guilt because I survived and maybe I was the one that nodded off at the wheel or whatever. And that is a huge logjam to grief, because guilt is such a powerful, I want to say freezer, stationary. It keeps people locked. It's a powerful lock that keeps people stuck in a place, because then they make themselves responsible for the death of another, and somehow, you know, they had a hand in this, and so they're culpable.
And it gets accentuated with this. I think, you know, survivor guilt can exist. It's funny, I'm sitting here thinking of a good friend of mine, and she's 90 years old now, and her son died. She's had several deaths in her family, and she said to me, you know, why am I still here? Yeah. Right? So there's the survivor guilt from a normal, natural pieces. But when I've also had clients, I've had a mother who was driving the car in which her 4-year-old daughter was killed. So, you know, that survivor guilt is a whole different piece and layer. And to be honest with you, I don't think you ever get over that. I think you live with the reality, and our goal there is to have it in us in a way that doesn't get in the way and create more damage. But that's a long, long process.
Yeah. Well, that's a huge piece of the grief that you carry. You know, I think about grief as learning how to live in a world without the person in it with you. If you have any sense of responsibility for the exit of another person, you're carrying that. And even if you don't, the accident was not your fault, but you're the one that survived. Say it's a bus accident and several people survive and several people die. The survivors will always say, why not? Why me? Why did I get to live when my friend died?
And there's people who want to use that to bring meaning into life, to say, well, you know, I must have a meaning now. That could be another podcast. I will say this about that one, the one that I'm thinking of, where mom was driving when her 4-year-old. It was 10 years later that she sent me a letter, a note, and she had found a picture that her daughter had drawn before the accident, and she was able to photocopy that picture and write me a note about where she's at now. And I'll never forget, there's a line in there that says, I could never have imagined 10 years ago that I would be able to live and smile again. So it's not gone. I mean, the sadness and the sorrow, and sometimes the pain of what happened, but there is a hope, but she'll always live with it, but it doesn't have to be that cutting dagger that gets stuck in your heart all the time.
Notice we're talking about that 10 years later, right?
10 years later.
And I really hope that the people who are listening to this episode really hear some of these timelines that we've said, you know, very purposefully tonight, that this is work of a lifetime. This is definitely in its acute phase work of the first many years after death, and it requires so much patience of ourselves and of each other. So as we start to bring this episode to a close, this is a really vast topic, and there's so many nuances to it, and I know we will in future episodes dedicate some episodes specifically to it. But this episode was really about we wanted just to make sure that we we started to have the conversation for those that are listening to the podcast. What else would you like to offer?
Well, I would just encourage people that while it's true that no two people experience grief the same, that there are a lot of reasons, a lot of influences, a lot of things that impact our own experience of grief, and this is the trouble I have with any kind of, cut and dry fix. Right? People say, "Oh, you just need to do this, this, and this." Be compassionate with your grief and recognize that your experience, if it's an unexpected death, cannot be lived the same way as other people who experience grief. And that doesn't mean you can't be in the same group with them if you're in a grief group. It doesn't mean you can't be. It just means that you do have to pay attention and be compassionate to yourself and recognize what it is that's happening in you. And be a little more patient, shall I say, which is really hard for all of us. So that goes for the person experiencing that grief, and for those who are friends and supporters and family, to be patient and recognize that this is a journey that everybody's going to do a little differently, and there's pieces of that journey that are there in an unexpected death that aren't there in other types of death.
And I guess I'd say, I was thinking, living is worth the risk. Because I was thinking back to that sense of the start of the conversation where we were talking about how a sudden death can really bring into sharp focus the fact that we're not in control, the fact that we're vulnerable, that our control is an illusion. A good illusion, if we can master it, but it's still an illusion. And so that sense of, you don't want that to have you sort of shy away and shut yourself in from life and never go out. And so to understand that life is worth the risk, but with that risk comes, some consequences that we're not necessarily expecting or planning for, but it's still worth the risk.
And I think my final thought is, it's something we've already mentioned, and I want to say it again. And I want to say it again really purposefully, because I find I have to say it many times to my clients over and over again. And that is that the shock stays longer than we think, in that when the grief, the sorrow, the anguish, the despair is intensifying, that is part of the normal process. Nothing about it feels normal, but there's not something wrong with you. That's you living through and grappling with, learning how to live in a world from this traumatic experience. And so that's just something that I really often see as my role as a witness and companion with my clients, is to keep reminding them of to be patient, to be compassionate, and that shock, when it wears off, that intensifying of grief is really part of the process. And I'm just hoping that other people will hear that too, who may be supporting people, or a boss or a manager who is an employee who's in a situation like that, or all the different ways that we interact with each other out there in the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough. Music by Paradise Garage. Technical support provided by Sean and Jonah Heikert. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio. You can find more episodes of What Now for free on most major podcast platforms, including Spotify, CastBox, Apple Podcasts, and Overcast. If you want to support us, please follow and leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And tell your friends. It does make a difference.